Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Wainrider Wednesdays, the weekly series where we take a look at progress for the upcoming mod for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion, Total War Wainriders, set in the Third Age of Middle-earth before the events of the War of the Ring by about 1,000 years, give or take. And in this episode, we're going to look at the campaign prospects for the Eotheod, which is a faction of largely Northmen who, for the most part, originated in Rovanian before the emergence of these Wainrider factions into their land. Around the year 1851 to 1856, the Wainriders emerge on the plains south of the River Running and east and south of Mirkwood, defeat Gondor, and then set about conquering the rest of the region, essentially, enslaving or occupying the territory. Those Northmen who survived and did not immediately enter the services of Gondor found a new home for themselves along the upper stretches of the Anduin, and there they became known as the Eotheod, which is also the name of a place, a territory farther north between the two rivers that lead into the Great River at its source. I think the Grey Well, or the Grey Flood and the Lang Well, something along those lines. But Eotheod is the name of both the place and the people, essentially. I think it means horse people, right, in Old English. And they will basically share some similarities with Rohan, as you would imagine, because they are their distant ancestors. So let's take a look at the starting text here that we've written for them that gives a bit of background. And again, just to remind everybody that what you are about to see here is a work in progress. We're still producing the mod, still changing things, still adjusting text. And here we've got the difficulty factor estimated to be home in time for tea, which is the easiest difficulty. Now, this is almost certainly just a holdover from Fourth Age Total War, where we based a lot of the map on, and Rohan in that mod was estimated as home in time for tea, one of the easiest factions to play. I doubt this is going to remain the case for the Eotheod. I believe that just looking at the map here, right, just looking at the number of factions that they have around them, that they will be a little more challenging than that. On the one hand, having a relatively small territory can be kind of an advantage, right, in a Total War game, because if you've got a few settlements tightly ranked near each other, then you can support them. You can easily produce a bunch of armies, and as long as they are reasonably profitable settlements, you can defend them fairly easily with not a lot of ground to cover. But on the other hand, with a lot of other factions nearby, you're going to be a little bit straitened. And so you've got some fairly large factions to your south, but some also, small factions to your north who may be wanting to make some elbow room for themselves. So this may be a little optimistic. So we're probably going to nudge that up one or two. I imagine they're going to be not the easiest faction on the map. At any rate, led by Marhuini, son of Marhari, former prince of Rovanian, the Eotheod make their homes now in the Vales of Anduin. A remnant of the Northmen who once dwelt in the broad lands east of Mirkwood and served as a bulwark of Gondor, they have been driven from their country by Easterlings they call the Wainriders, a powerful new folk, well-armed and numerous, swarming over the land and slaying or enslaving all who do not flee. Those who survived the westward flight have lost none of their valor or their desire for vengeance. Though distant now from beleaguered Gondor, the Eotheod are still allied to those men of the stony lands and white towers, and will gladly fight at their side once more. But with or without allies, the Northmen plan to strike against the Wainriders as soon as they have the strength to do so. Meanwhile, they must settle their herds and families in their new homes. For the most part clinging to the lands about the Great River, they look not to southern Mirkwood, which has grown dark and evil of late, nor to the elves of nearby Lindorinand or the Woodland Realm, who have withdrawn into their fastnesses, as have the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Other folk dwell in the mountains, orcs and wicked men, some of whom have pushed into the lands about the sources of the Anduin. These rivals will no doubt challenge the Eotheod as they seek to establish themselves. Somewhat straitened in their new homes, the Eotheod will certainly come to blows with these and other peoples. A proud and warlike folk, the Northmen must fight for their very survival before they can fight to reclaim that which was lost. Now, historically speaking, we do see the Eotheod relocate into the north not long after sort of the what you might consider the end date of the mod. Of course, this mod is not going to end at any particular date, but the Wainrider Wars essentially ended in the south in 1944 and in the north around 1976, I want to say. I think that was the year, either that or 1975, of the fall of Angmar. And when Angmar fell, the Eotheod moved north because they realized all of a sudden that those evil men who were living at the sources of the Anduin were relatively weak, and so they were able to drive them away. They did leave behind a fair number of men in the Middle Vales, however, and so many centuries later, when Eorl rides down to the aid of Gondor, he's able to bring enough people with him to essentially settle the area and repopulate it. But let's jump into the campaign map here to take a look at the actual settlements you're going to have, see what kind of river systems you'll have to work with, and where your borders are going to lie. Here we are on the campaign map with the Eotheod starting position, and you'll notice at the beginning here that they've got very little of it. Only 2 settlements, I think. We've got the central Anduin Vales here, which is essentially comprising their capital, located, interestingly, on the west side of the river. And then they do have a presence on the east side with the western Mirkwood Eaves. But that, I believe, is it. Yeah, the central Anduin Vales do stretch across the river a little bit, but otherwise that's it, the only 2 settlements. However, it does have to be said that at least initially how they're set up, we do have 3 Eotheod armies standing rather menacingly just outside this rebel settlement of Adlan in the Gladden Vales. So there are going to be some nearby settlements that you may be able to poach relatively early on. And of course, this is not necessarily going to be the start position. You're not going to have like 3 guys, 3 armies standing around a settlement. We've still got to set up all of those things. But I believe this is going to be your 2 starting settlements, and then there will be a rebel one nearby. Of course, this is not the only rebel settlement in your territory. You'll find some others of those to the south. A little bit further to the south, though, will be Lorien, right? This is Lorien, and here would be the rough position of Moria, or the Dwerodelf. So you're going to have a little bit of territory in between you and the presence of the High Elves down here. And also the High Elves are going to be a neighbor relatively soon in the north and west. If you go over the High Pass here, Rivendell is not very far from your own territory. However, to get there, you would have to first go through the territory that is either held by rebels. As you can tell to your north, the upper Anduin Vales are rebel territory, or Orcish. To your immediate west, the eastern Hithaglir foothills are commanded by some of the Misty Mountain Orcs. So they are another active faction in this area, in addition to the elves, the dwarves, and then a little bit further north, right about here, you've got Angmar, which has, I believe, just a single settlement on this side of the Misty Mountains. So quite a lot to consider. Initially, of course, it'll depend on how many men we give you as the Eotheod in terms of where you think you're going to go. Can you get away with focusing on both north and south at the same time? Are you going to want to focus your attention on getting the easy, local, close-by rebel settlement, or do you want to instead strike out at a proper faction? That's always my preferred route, by the way, almost always. The rebels are not going to threaten you for the most part. They're just going to sit in their territory. They can do stuff like get armies in woodlands and ambush positions, and you may blunder into them, so that can be a threat. But realistically, they're not going to build up and train a bunch of units that they're going to send aggressively into your lands. So looking at your neighbors is probably going to be the better bet. The interesting thing about the Eotheod to me is, it's easy to look at them as sort of a Rohan light or a proto-Rohan faction. To some extent, of course, that's true because they certainly are that. And if you remember the video that I did a while back previewing their battle options, the unit roster available to the Eotheod, they do have a cavalry presence. However, they also have a pretty strong infantry roster. They've got at least a decent amount of variety there. So this is not a strict cavalry faction. They're going to be relying on woodman types and even what you might think of as proto-Bjorning types. So this is kind of a mix. These are, of course, the refugees from Rovanion. They're going to have that Northman sort of familiarity with cavalry, but they're in new territory. They're not strong yet, and so they're going to be depending on sort of the more rugged footbound units, I think, to really make up a lot of their strength. Some notable things about this territory, though, in addition just to the different borders and the different provinces, are the passages, both over the rivers and through the woods. Right near your starting settlement, right across the ford, you'll be able to get on one of the main routes through Mirkwood, right back towards the river running, and thence down into Rovanian territory that was once held by your forefathers not too very long ago. In fact, just a few years ago. So this is one route you could take to get down into some territory that initially is going to be held by rebels, I believe. The Western Horde, that Wainrider faction, is actually centered more around here. They've got a few settlements, further to the east and further south, but I don't believe they start with territory in the north on the east side of the Forest of Mirkwood. So if you get yourself set up pretty quickly and have the spare armies, you could quickly send a raiding party through the woods relatively early. There's also another route to the south. There will be a rebel settlement and rebel territory down here. This is the Narrows of Mirkwood. But you could emerge, rather surprisingly, right close to what would be essentially the center of power for the Western Horde, and that would be a great benefit. So I see that as, maybe a sort of a mid-game goal, like late early game, early mid-game. You want to get some province or two snapped up, maybe conquer a rebel territory, and then maybe head east. On the other hand, you do have a lot of things to do in this relatively narrow woods. Of course, you've got, in addition to Angmar and the orcs nearby, you do have the elves of the Woodland Realm up here. And one thing that I'm really curious to find out is how they're going to play as an AI faction. Same thing with Khazad Dûm, with the dwarves of Durin's folk. These are relatively isolated 1 or 2 province factions. They may be making some territorial gains for themselves, and the High Elves as well. So these are factions that, coming from 4th Age Total War, I'm used to these non-managed factions being passive on the campaign map, and that is not necessarily going to be the case. Now, they may be busy with other things. They're going to be certainly involved with other wars, but it may be something that you have to think about. They may take some of these rebel settlements before you can, for example, or they may quickly invade Angmar or something. So you may have some of your options dictated by what your neighboring factions do. And then maybe one of the biggest questions I have is Gondor. Gondor in the south, of course, is a very strong faction. At least they start with a lot of territory in what looks to be a strong position. Again, we haven't set up their financial or economic situation yet, or exactly determined how strong their military will be. But in the books, in the lore of these Wainrider conflicts, there is a strong cooperation between the Eotheod and Gondor. From the very earliest days of the invasion of Rovanian through all of the subsequent campaigns. The 1899 revolt is probably the most dramatic involvement of the Eotheod with Gondor, cooperating to send bandits, revolutionaries essentially, through the woods to stage a slave revolt that is fairly successful of the what we're calling the Western Horde, the Wainriders of Rovanian, at the same time as the King of Gondor is leading an army north from Ithilien to the plains south of Mirkwood. And then in 1944, you have Eotheod, or at least Northmen, in the armies of Gondor. And I believe the Eotheod may have even sent some men down past the Undeeps as well to sort of take part in that last final clash between the Eastern Wainriders and the people of Gondor. So the question I would have is how can you help Gondor as the Eotheod? That's probably what you're going to want to do if you're at all familiar with the lore, and you're going to have the same enemies as they will. Of course, culturally speaking, the Eotheod are going to be solidly middlemen, and so their settlement types, as we've seen before, are going to follow that pattern, featuring wooden halls, wooden houses, clusters of settlements, the occasional wall or stockade, but nothing too formidable typically. And that middleman culture is actually going to help them a little bit as they expand north. If you conquer territory held by Angmar, Angmar also is kind of technically a middleman culture faction. So you'll be able to move in and take over their territory fairly well, not just here, not just in the one settlement that they own east of the Misty Mountains, but also potentially to the west. So that is another option. Instead of simply focusing on the Anduin Vale and points east, you may think about crossing the mountains westward getting yourself involved with this part of the world. And how interesting would that be to see the Eotheod, the Northmen, actually fighting for control of parts of Eriador with whatever factions are over here squabbling over the ruins. Well, that is the Eotheod, a 2-province starter faction, but one that I imagine you'll be able to expand fairly quickly into a respectable 3 or 4 settlement faction. If you've read the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, you know that these guys have a long and storied history with heroes and kings and long rides and dragon slayings and so on. It's a really interesting tale of a people who we first learn of on the eastern fringe of Mirkwood and end up all the way down in Calenardon into the 4th Age. So the Eotheod, it all sort of starts here for them. Well, hope you enjoyed this quick look at the campaign prospects for this faction. We do have a few more to look at, just 3, I think. 3 or maybe 4. But we'll be finishing them up fairly soon, and then we'll get on to previewing other things. Of course, follow the channel for more of those other videos, and feel free to check out previous videos where we talk about mechanics, unit rosters, and other campaign previews. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, everybody, take care.